Hello dear students and friends, I welcome you in yet another lecture on Western political thought. In today's lecture, we are going to discuss one of the important medieval political philosopher, Marsigilio of Padua. In the current lecture, our focus will be upon the following points: life and works of Marsigilio, examine the conditions in Europe and their influence over Marsigilio, his theory of state, his theory of law, and his ideas over the separation of church and state as the foundation of a secular state. Thus, I begin with a detailed sketch of Marsigilio of Padua, also known as Marsilius of Padua, but hereafter referred to as Marsigilio. Marsigilio was born in the northern city of Italy of Padua. Hence, he belonged to the Middle Ages. Marsigilio belonged to a prominent family, which was quite active in the civic administration of Padua. His father was a legal official. While on the other hand, during the 13th and 14th century, Europe was going through a turbulent phase, mainly because of the controversy between Pope and Emperor for supremacy. Similarly, in the beginning of the 14th century, when Marsigilio was in Paris, he might have witnessed the trial of Boniface VIII. Consequently, this anti-papal and anti-clerical atmosphere must have greatly influenced Marsigilio and his views about politics and the state. On the other hand, Italy was torn with internal conflicts between and among petty princes. In the year 1311, Marsigilio went to Paris, where he studied medicine at the Paris University, and later he became the rector of the same university. During his stay in Paris, he met John of Gendon, who was associated with a party known for its Averroism politics. And before I move forward, I would like to explain briefly the term Averroism. Averroism is a medieval school of philosophy originated in the late 13th century, which was based on the works of the 12th century Arab philosopher Averroes, also known as Ibn Rushd, and his interpretations of Aristotle and his reconciliation of Aristotelianism with the Islamic faith. The term Averroism itself was coined as late as the 19th century. According to G.H. Sabine, the essential characteristics of Latin Averroism were its thoroughgoing naturalistic and rationalism. Both Marsigilio and John developed a good friendship. The two wrote a book titled The Defender of Peace in the summer of 1324. However, there is a controversy as to the authorship of this book. According to some scholars, it is exclusively work of the Marsigilio, whereas others ascribe the authorship to both Marsigilio and John of Gendon. However, there are some authors who say that the book was primarily written by Marsigilio with some sort of collaboration and support from John. The book is a landmark in the history of medieval political thought in general and history of political thought in particular. It is remarkable for its coherence, originality, and argumentation. The papal response to the book was very hostile. In 1327, Pope John XXII condemned the authors. He described the book full of heresies and authors as the pupil of damnation. In addition, Marsigilio also wrote on the transference of empire, in which he subverted pro-papal histories of how the popes were responsible for the legitimacy of the current German Empire. Between 1339 and 1341, Marsigilio composed a few more writings, and one of them is the Smaller Defender. Marsigilio died in late 1342. After the brief sketch of Marsigilio, let us have an overview of his political philosophy. Marsigilio of Padua is an important medieval political thinker. He played a significant role in germinating the roots for limited monarchy and supremacy of state over church. Marsigilio was also greatly influenced by four strands of thought. First was the Aristotelianism, Second was the Averroism that called for separation of faith and reason. In other words, separation of church and the state. The third strand of thought was that of the spiritual Franciscan, who were turning now to the state for help in reforming the church. Fourth strand was Augustinianism, with its emphasis on God's immediate and direct control of the entire universe and the need for love or charity to make all other virtues, individual or social, possible. Nevertheless, a look through the text of the Defender of Peace, one of the major book or work by Marsigilio, suggests that the Marsigilio was in fact familiar with and influenced by a broader range of texts than this approach implies. In particular, one would be remiss to exclude Sarro from any list of sources or authorities whose use in the book The Defender of Peace ought to be investigated. The book The Defender of Peace he had written with inputs from John is an immensely influential text in the history of Western political thought. In the book, Marsigilio offers a detailed analysis and explanation of political communities before going on to attack what he saw as the obstacles to peaceful human coexistence, principally the contemporary papacy. The book Defender of Peace consists of three main parts. The first part is a statement of Aristotelian principles. Its purpose is to supply the foundations for the second part, in which Marsigilio draws his conclusion regarding the church, the functions of the priest, their relation to civil authority, and the evils which arise from a misunderstanding of these matters. The third part consists of 42 theses or conclusions drawn from the theories developed in the first two parts of the book. According to Marsigilio, church is not an institution with Pope at its head, but the whole Christendom, the body of the faithful believing in and calling upon the name of the Christ, and there was no difference between the clergy and the laity. Thus, many scholars considered him a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation and an architect both of the Machiavellian state and of the modern democracy. Given his political doctrine and ideas, Marsigilio of Padua is considered to be ahead of his times as the first secular political theorist, the first post-classical thinker to espouse republicanism, and a scholastic precursor of the civic humanities of the Renaissance. This was an introduction about Marsigilio's political philosophy. Now let us have a separate discussion on some of the basic tenets of his political philosophy. And I begin with Marsigilio's theory of the state. Marsigilio follows Aristotle in his conception of the state, and being influenced by the Averroism, gives us a naturalistic interpretation of the Aristotelianism. While following Aristotle, Marsigilio states that man is a gregarious animal and the state is like a living being, composed of parts which perform the functions necessary to its life. The state, however, is a complex community in which very diverse duties have to be performed and needs satisfied. Thus, we have the 6 Aristotelian parts or professions of the state: agriculturalists, artisans, soldiers, merchants, priests, and judges. All these classes in their own way contribute to the common good. There are farmers and artisans who supply material goods and revenue required for the government, while as soldiers, officials, priests who make up the state in the stricter sense. The last class, the clergy, were necessary to encourage moral goodness among men by supramundane sanctions. State's health or peace consists in the orderly working of each of its parts, and strife arises when one part does its work badly or interferes with another. After asserting the necessity of peace for the continued survival of the state, Marsigilio concluded that the only legitimate agent for peace was the people as a whole, for the self-evident reason that whole was superior to any part, because it would be inefficient for all the people to govern. Therefore, authority had to be delegated to a governing body that would necessarily be the most essential part of the state. With the government elevated to the supreme role in the state, priests, like rest of men, became subject to the rulers, whose authority was derived from the whole of people. If the papacy were given equal or superior power, there would be no rulers in the state and the strife would be inevitable. On the issues of good life, Marsigilio states that man is naturally constituted to live in civil societies, by which alone the man could attain the good life. However, by sufficient life, Marsigilio does not mean all that Aristotle meant by good life or Thomas Hobbes by the virtuous life. The sufficient life, according to Marsigilio, is essentially about the preconditions of a good and virtuous. Like Aristotle, Marsigilio recognized that the first principle of political, that is to say social, life is that ordinary rational men share with the rest of the animal kingdom the desire to satisfy what we would now call the basic needs. The states will be judged good or bad to the extent that they provide for these basic needs. The standard by which states will be judged is its economic efficiency. The provision of the peace and order is what government is for, so that men find themselves in a position to take advantage of the good things that the God provides through nature. This was an understanding of theory of the state by Marsigilio. Now let us shift to another important component of his political philosophy, and that is his theory of law. The originality of Marsigilio consists in his conception of law, its framing and its application. Marsigilio states that the law is of two kinds, divine and human. Divine law, according to Marsigilio, and I quote here, is a command of God directly, without any human deliberation, about voluntary acts of human beings to be done or avoided in this world, but for the sake of attaining of the best end or some condition desirable to man in the world to come, unquote. The rewards or punishment for these laws are to be given in the next world, and this is the greatest distinguishing factor between the human law and the divine law. As in the case of the former, the rewards were awarded or punishments inflicted in this world. Further, the divine law is merely ethical teaching, while the distinguishing factor of human law is its imperative and coercive character. On the other hand, the human law is framed by the whole community, or at least its prevailing part. According to Marsigilio, human law is a command of the whole body of citizens, or of its prevailing part, arising directly from the deliberations of those empowered to make laws about voluntary acts of human beings to be done or avoided in this world for the sake of attaining the best end or some condition desirable for man in this world. I mean, a command of the transgression of which is enforced in this world by a penalty or punishment imposed on the transgressor. Unlike Saint Thomas Aquinas, which represented divine and human law as all of a piece and stressed the rational derivation of human law from the law of nature, for Marsigilio, the essence of law is its coercive character, and law is useless if it is not obeyed by the people. In case of Saint Thomas, law was to be determined by its content and justice it embodied, while as for Marsigilio, law was what the community or the legislator humans, as he calls it, may desire. He does admit that law must be based on justice. But justice for Marsigilio is quite different than what it was for Saint Thomas. The definition and valuation of justice, which must be embodied in law, entirely depends upon the will of the legislator, which is itself also the source of the law's imperative character. It is the needs and desires of the community as expressed in law through the legislator humans that is to determine or evaluate justice. Marsigilio has not been propounding any revolutionary or new doctrine of democracy. He was reinterpreting, though more clearly and boldly, the traditional judgment of the Middle Ages. His theory resembled more to that of Roman doctrine of transmission of power from prince to the people. On the issue of application and enforcement of law, Marsigilio argued that though the law is framed and established by the legislator humans, but it is applied by the pars principans, that is the medieval prince, and it is the latter's duty to govern in accordance with it. The pars principans is no executive in the modern sense of the term. It is merely an ad hoc agent of the legislator. In fact, the legislature institutes the pars principans and draws up the rules under which it in turn establishes the other parts in the states and continues to rule. This prince or a ruler is to work according to the law laid down by the legislator. There is no division of power, since all power ultimately belongs to the legislator, who is the real and supreme creative force within the state and of the state itself. Here, writers like Girk have found the terms of popular sovereignty in Marsigilio's theory. The other significant part of the Marsigilio's philosophy consists of his ideas about defining the relation between church and the state. Marsigilio may have borrowed his theory of the state from Aristotle, but his concept of the relations between church and the state are original with himself. In the second part of his book, The Defender of Peace, Marsigilio deliberated upon the relations between the church and the state. Marsigilio studies the question with a quite a new approach. He is faced with the dilemma that in every society and in all times there has been a religious institution. Without answering as to the reason of its existence, Marsigilio gives a political basis to the priesthood. As we have seen, he described it as a department of the state. This view was opposed to the contemporary papal view. For him, the church was not an institution with the Pope at its head, but the whole Christendom, the body of the faithful believing and calling upon the name of Christ. There was no difference between the clergy and the laity. Of course, he admits the necessity of the clergy. His function was to provide for the education of the revelations of God. However, it is the state and not the church as understood in the Middle Ages who is to appoint them. Mainly because though the religious acts of individual brings their reward or punishment in the next world, they have social and political consequences and hence are to be controlled by the state. Thus, his interpretation of medieval controversy was legal one. For him, the ultimate source of power both in spiritual and temporal matters was the same, and that is the community. Unlike writers like Dante who have been taking defensive positions, Marsigilio for the first time took an offensive position in relation to the church authority. His novelty consists in his view that there was unity in religious and political life. Both the religious and political bodies coincide completely in one. However, for him also state cannot live without the church and vice versa. The disobedience to the divine law will be punished after grave. If it is punished in this world through the devices of heresy and excommunication, they must be controlled by the state because they will have temporal effects. Punishment in this world must be determined by civil law. It is this idea of unity of Marsigilio that has contributed towards the development of our conception of unitary state. For him, no other law can be prevalent in the state except that of the state, and there is no law, natural or divine, supreme over it. There is no limitation over the law of the state. It is an embodiment of justice. This was a discussion regarding some of the basic or core tenets of Marsigilio's political philosophy. Let us now conclude what we discussed so far. Marsigilio of Padua is one of the leading medieval political thinkers. His book, The Defender of Peace, published in 1324, is the best known book in a huge literature devoted to the question of rightful spheres of secular and religious princes. What makes it remarkable is its firm overall grasp of the problems involved and the clarity with which Marsigilio sets out his anti-papal argument in favor of the power of the secular authority. In his thought, Marsigilio addresses key political concerns, including relationship between church and the state, democratic political process, the idea of a secular state, the concept of religion as a fundamental individual matter, and the sovereignty of the people. His political thought has therefore been finding increasing appeal among modern readers. Thus, we can see why he has been called the precursor of Machiavelli, Locke, Rousseau and Karl Marx, and at times the father of modern political philosophy. With this, I conclude today's lecture. Hope to see you again. Till then, goodbye.